The click of Jennifer's high heels echoed sharply through the house, each step louder than the last. Frank, bent over his laptop at the kitchen table, was lost in his work, completely unaware of anything beyond the glow of the screen. The only sound accompanying him was the steady ticking of the clock, until the abrupt clatter of heels shattered the quiet. His eyes finally lifted, unfocused at first, then honing in on Jennifer, who stood at the doorway. She wore a sleek white dress, tight and undeniably striking. That dress. He hadn't seen it in years, and it hugged her figure in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Her lips, painted a bold crimson, curved into a self-satisfied grin as she turned slightly, admiring herself in the mirror by the hallway. Her hands slid down her sides, smoothing the fabric with a slow, deliberate motion. For a few moments, Frank just stared, frozen in place, the silence stretching. A slow, creeping sense of dread settled in his chest, like the first rumble of an approaching storm. Jennifer. His voice wavered, tension threading through every word. Where are you going? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she adjusted her hair, running her fingers through it slowly, each second of silence between them growing heavier. The tension was thick enough to snap at any moment. When she finally turned toward him, her eyes were cold and distant. This wasn't the woman he'd been married to for 28 years. I'm going out tonight, she said, her tone unnervingly calm. I'm meeting my lover. The words fell from her lips so casually, as though she were talking about everyday plans. Frank shoved his laptop aside and stood up, as if her words had physically hit him. What are you talking about? His voice shook, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just heard. You're not going anywhere, he added, a note of desperation creeping in. There hadn't been any plans tonight. Their life lately had been quiet, filled with dinners at home and evenings together on the couch. With who? He whispered, his voice barely audible, a heavy knot tightening in his gut. Her smile widened, brimming with satisfaction. With Greg, she replied, her easy mention of the name sending a sharp pain through Frank's chest. Greg, he muttered, his voice cracking. My boss, Greg. The words were like poison in his mouth, his pulse racing as if the walls were closing in on him. Sweat gathered on his forehead as he searched her face for any sign of a joke, desperately hoping this was some cruel prank. But her expression remained unchanged, still distant, still triumphant. Yes, your boss, she confirmed with a dismissive wave of her hand, as though none of it mattered. We've been seeing each other for about a year now, Frank. It was as if the floor had vanished beneath him. The calm that usually defined him evaporated in an instant. His fists clenched at his sides, his whole body trembling with a mix of shock, disbelief, and growing rage. What the hell are you saying? His voice shook, but he held his ground, never breaking eye contact. This can't be real, Jennifer. It can't. She crossed her arms over her chest, her posture defiant, like she was daring him to argue. I'm not bluffing, Frank, she said with a cruel glint in her eyes. Greg lights a fire in me that you haven't in a long time. I promised him an unforgettable night. Frank recoiled, her words cutting deeper than any physical blow. This is insane, he growled, spitting out her lover's name like venom. You're leaving me for him. Greg's nothing but a womanizer. He doesn't care about you. Her gaze turned sharp, defiant. And you do. When was the last time you looked at me like that, Frank? You've turned into a shadow of the man I married. Predictable. Boring. Greg makes me feel wanted. Frank stood there, as if frozen in place, unable to process what was happening. The woman he had shared almost 30 years with stood in front of him, confessing an affair with his boss. His fists clenched, nails digging into his palms painfully. You can't do this, Jennifer, he said, his voice thick with disbelief. She rolled her eyes, clearly irritated. Don't you dare tell me what I can or can't do. I'm done living by your rules. This marriage ended long ago, and I'm finished pretending. Frank felt his anger rising like a storm surge. You're really ready to throw everything away? 28 years, Jennifer. All the memories, everything we built, you're risking it all for what? For some fling. Her expression hardened in annoyance. It's more than just a fling, Frank. Greg is the man who makes me feel alive, something you haven't done in years. You've become an empty shell of the man you used to be, she said coldly. And I'm not pretending to be happy anymore. Frank stepped forward, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. I don't care what you think of me, he growled, his voice low and simmering with restrained fury. But tonight, you're not going anywhere. Not with him, not with anyone. Jennifer arched an eyebrow, a mocking smirk tugging at her lips. Don't you dare try to control me, Frank, she hissed. You never had any power over me, and you never will. I made Greg a promise, and I intend to keep it. Frank's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at her, struggling to wrap his mind around her audacity. If you walk out that door, he warned, his voice trembling with finality, we're done. Do you understand me, Jennifer? This is the end. Jennifer paused only for a moment, her eyes narrowing as though she were weighing his words. Then, with a flick of her hand, she dismissed him like he was nothing more than a speck of dust on her sleeve. You're pathetic, she spat, her voice cold as ice, each word dripping with deliberate cruelty. Frank's breath caught in his throat. He stood rooted in place, unable to move, as Jennifer turned away from him. Calmly, without a glance back, she picked up her purse and headed for the door. Each of her steps echoed through the room, like the relentless ticking of a clock counting down the final moments of their marriage. Jennifer, he called out, his voice thick with desperation. If you leave now, don't think about coming back. I mean it. She never paused, her footsteps steady. The door creaked open, allowing the cold night air to spill into their home like an unwelcome guest. Then came the quiet but resolute click as the door shut behind her, sealing her departure from his life. Frank stood there, staring at the closed door, as if by sheer willpower he could make it open again, praying she would turn around and return. But the house was empty now, filled with a suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. His heart raced, his breath shallow, a knot of confusion and anger tightening in his chest. Slowly, he sank into a chair, his trembling hands running over his face. The weight of what had just happened bore down on him, an unbearable burden he hadn't expected. She was gone, not just for tonight, but for good. She was gone, from his life, their marriage, and everything they had built together. The crushing reality of her betrayal hit him like a tidal wave, squeezing his heart in a relentless grip. His eyes remained fixed on the spot where she had stood just moments earlier. Now, there was only emptiness. Memories of the years they'd spent together flickered in his mind like broken fragments of an old film. Dinners, vacations, quiet moments, it all seemed shattered in an instant. For the first time in nearly 30 years, he was truly alone in a house that suddenly felt far too big, too hollow. He sat there, enveloped by a silence that felt never-ending, his thoughts circling back again and again to their last conversation. Her mocking laughter, her sharp words, the way she had left as if none of it mattered. Slowly, something inside him began to change. The initial shock began to morph into something darker, more determined. His jaw tightened, and his eyes hardened. She thought she could leave him broken, that his world would crumble without her. But she had no idea what was coming. Frank's gaze wandered around the room, settling on the framed photos lining the walls. Those once happy moments, frozen in time, now mocked him, haunting reminders of a life that no longer existed. She was willing to throw it all away for a meaningless affair with his boss. Fine. But this wouldn't be the end. Abruptly, Frank pushed himself up from the chair, a sudden clarity cutting through the fog of the evening. The path ahead wasn't uncertain anymore. There was only one choice left, and he had to make it on his terms. Sleep felt like an impossibility that night. He lay in bed, motionless, staring at the ceiling as the events of the evening replayed endlessly in his mind. The sound of Jennifer's heels, her biting words, and that cold, mocking laugh swirled in his thoughts like an unrelenting storm. The woman he had spent nearly 3 decades with had chosen to leave him, for Greg, of all people. The betrayal was like a bolt of lightning, as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath him in an instant. His world was in pieces, but through the wreckage, something new began to emerge. Revenge. As the hours dragged on, his grief solidified into something colder, more focused. He wasn't going to beg her to come back. There would be no apologies, no desperate attempts to salvage a marriage that was already beyond repair. Jennifer had made her choice, and now, she would face the consequences. With the first light of dawn filtering through the window, Frank made up his mind. Slowly, he climbed out of bed. In the bathroom, he splashed cold water on his face and stared into the mirror. The man staring back wasn't the same one who had been caught off guard just hours earlier. This man was resolute, unwavering, and ready to take back control of his life. Without hesitation, Frank got dressed and headed to the kitchen. The silence in the house pressed down on him, but he ignored it. There was work to be done. Sitting at the table, he grabbed the phone and dialed his lawyer's number. After 2 rings, a familiar, groggy voice picked up. "Frank, it's early. What's going on?" "I need you to start the divorce," Frank said, his voice firm, unshaken. There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure? Divorce is a serious move." "I'm sure," he replied, the conviction clear in his tone. "No delays. I want it done quickly and cleanly." "All right," his lawyer replied, now fully focused on the job at hand. Frank ended the call and let out a long breath. "I'll handle the paperwork," he had told his lawyer. It wouldn't take much, just a few signatures, but he was determined to push it through as fast as possible. Setting the phone down, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes resting on the still, empty kitchen. It was done. There was no turning back now, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Jennifer wouldn't win him over again with her charm, her sweet talk, or her hollow promises. He wasn't going to give her another chance. His next step was clear, their joint bank account. They had managed it together for years, but there was no way he'd let her use their savings to run off with Greg. With a firm click of a few keys, he transferred all the funds into his personal account, leaving the joint account completely drained. Jennifer had made it clear she didn't need him, and now she wouldn't see a penny of his money. Once that was done, his attention turned to the house. The place that had once stood for their shared dreams and hard-earned life together had become nothing but a prison filled with painful memories. Wasting no time, Frank reached out to a real estate agent and listed the house for sale. Any attachment to it had long since disappeared. "Are you sure you want to sell this quickly?" the agent asked, sensing the urgency in his voice. "Absolutely," Frank replied, his tone icy and firm. "Set a low price. I just want it gone." By noon, everything was already in motion. The divorce papers were being drawn up, the bank account was cleared, and the house was officially on the market. The speed of it all left Frank feeling slightly off balance, like events were moving faster than he could fully absorb. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. Jennifer had made her choice, and Frank was making sure she'd face the fallout, alone. He leaned back in the chair, taking in the kitchen one last time. This wasn't a home anymore, just an empty shell, echoing with memories that had been ruined. His gaze landed on the photos hanging on the walls, snapshots of happier times, vacations, birthdays, holidays, all now tainted by her betrayal. He stood up and walked to the nearest frame, staring at the faces frozen in time. There he was, standing beside Jennifer during their anniversary trip to Paris. He had thought they were happy then. Maybe they were. Or maybe it had all been a lie from the beginning. With a deep sigh of resignation, he took the photo down and placed it face down on the table. One by one, he removed each picture, leaving the walls bare, stripped of the past. He couldn't stand to look at them anymore. When the last frame was gone, Frank returned to the kitchen. He grabbed a piece of paper and quickly scribbled a short note, "You made your choice." He placed it on the kitchen table beside the neatly arranged divorce papers his lawyer had already sent over. The clarity of the situation hit him like a cold wave. There were no more illusions left. The act was over. The lies, the pretense, all of it had reached its end. Frank cast one last look around the room before grabbing his car keys. He didn't care to see her reaction. Whatever she had to say, however she handled it, was none of his concern anymore. This chapter of his life was finished, and he had no plans to look back. As he drove away, a strange sense of calm began to settle over him. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, but now it felt more controlled, more purposeful. For the first time in years, Frank felt like he was steering his own life again. He wasn't the shattered man Jennifer had left behind the night before. He had become someone else, stronger. The city rushed by in streaks of color as Frank drove aimlessly, with no set destination in mind. But that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was not going back to that house. Not yet. He needed space, time to breathe, to think, and to figure out his next move. After what felt like hours, he pulled into a parking lot by the coast. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the horizon. Frank stepped out of the car, feeling the cool breeze hit his face as he made his way toward the ocean. The steady rhythm of the waves crashing against the shore stood in sharp contrast to the chaos that had overtaken him in the past 24 hours. As he stood there, gazing out at the horizon, the weight of it all began to lift. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel trapped. The chains of a marriage that had suffocated him under the weight of others' expectations had finally been broken. As the sun climbed higher, Frank turned away from the water and walked back to his car. His decision was made. Now it was Jennifer's turn to face the consequences. He had no intention of watching her crumble. His focus was on rebuilding his life, and that was all that mattered. The next day, the sound of Jennifer's heels clicking against the parquet floor echoed through the now empty house. She was prepared for a confrontation, maybe even a heated argument where she could assert her newfound independence alongside Greg, reveling in the life she had chosen. In her mind, Frank would be there, seething with anger, but ultimately begging for forgiveness. She thought she held all the cards, finally free of the man she had come to resent. But as she stepped further into the house, something felt off. The silence that greeted her was more than unsettling. It wasn't just quiet, it was a cold, unnatural stillness that sent a shiver down her spine. "Frank," she called out, her voice slicing through the silence like a knife. No answer. Only the hollow echo of her own voice. Her heels tapped rhythmically on the floor as she made her way toward the kitchen, expecting to find him there, perhaps lost in thought or in tears. But he wasn't there. Instead, something far more ominous awaited her. On the kitchen table, arranged with unnerving precision, was a neat stack of papers. Divorce papers. The sight of them hit her like a punch in the gut, instantly dispelling the faint satisfaction she had felt after her evening with Greg. The laughter that had bubbled inside her vanished, replaced by a crushing emptiness. Jennifer froze, paralyzed as she stared at the perfectly arranged documents and the note beside them, "You made your choice. Now live with it." Her breath caught in her throat as her mind raced to comprehend what she was seeing. This wasn't what she had expected. She had imagined Frank devastated by her betrayal, maybe storming in with accusations or breaking down, but disappearing. That had never crossed her mind. Her hands shook as she picked up the papers, flipping through them in disbelief. It was all real. He had already started the divorce process. Everything was in order, meticulously arranged. All that was missing was her signature. "No, this can't be happening," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. A wave of panic washed over her, and she fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Frank's number. Each unanswered ring seemed to pound in her ears like thunder. "Frank, please, pick up," she whispered, her voice laced with desperation. The call went straight to voicemail. Desperation gripped her as she left a rushed message, her voice trembling with urgency. "Frank, it's Jennifer. We need to talk. Please call me." She sent message after message, each more frantic than the last, but none of them were read. Not a single response. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth. The crushing weight of reality started to press down on her as the bitter truth began to set in. Frank wasn't waiting for her. He wasn't coming back. He was gone. With panic rising in her chest, she bolted upstairs to their bedroom, throwing open the closet doors. His clothes were gone. His shoes. His belongings. Everything had disappeared. She hurried to the bathroom, yanking open the medicine cabinet, empty. It was as though he had wiped every trace of himself from the house. The full realization hit her like a tidal wave. Frank wasn't just hurt. He had made up his mind. Standing in front of the empty closet, her heart pounded wildly. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Jennifer had always believed that Frank would be the one who couldn't cope without her, that he would crumble under the weight of their breakup. But now, she stood in the ruins, stripped of everything she had once taken for granted. Her thoughts spiraling, she stumbled back downstairs and rushed to the computer, her heart racing. In a panic, she logged into their joint bank account, hoping to find something, anything, to hold on to. But the screen confirmed her worst nightmare. The balance was zero. Frank had withdrawn every cent, the savings they had painstakingly built over the years, gone. He had transferred it all into an account she couldn't access. "No," she whispered, her throat tightening. He couldn't have done this. But he had. The money, the house, their shared life, everything was crumbling before her eyes. The weight of it all pressed down on her, and her head spun. Her vision darkened as the full consequences of her choices crashed down on her. She had lost everything. But for what? A fleeting, meaningless fling with her husband's boss. Suddenly, her phone rang, snapping her out of her daze. It was Greg. For a moment, she dared to hope. "Greg will fix this," she told herself. "He'll pull me out of this nightmare." She answered the call, struggling to mask the desperation in her voice. "Greg," she whispered, "I need to talk. Frank is gone. He took everything," she blurted out. There was silence on the other end. When Greg finally spoke, his voice was distant. "Yeah." A chill ran down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, anxiety swelling in her chest. Greg exhaled slowly. "Jennifer, what we had, it was fun, okay? It was exciting, but I'm not looking for anything serious." Her body froze. "What are you saying?" "We've been together for almost a year," she exclaimed, her voice shaking as she refused to believe what she was hearing. "Yeah, and it was great," he replied, his casual tone cutting through her like a knife. "But I'm not here to commit. You left Frank. That's your problem, not mine." Jennifer gripped the phone tighter, paralyzed by shock. "You're just going to walk away? After everything?" Her voice wavered, but Greg's response was icy. "Jennifer, this was your decision. You turned your back on your marriage. It's all on you, not me." His words hit her like a slap. "It was your choice." The same thing Frank had written in his note. "Greg, wait," she stammered, her voice trembling, but he cut her off. "Look, I've got too much going on right now. I can't deal with this drama," he said, his tone distant and detached. "I think it's best if we stop seeing each other." And with that, the line went dead. Jennifer stood there, still clutching the phone to her ear, even after the call had ended. Greg had just left her. The man she had sacrificed everything for had discarded her as easily as canceling a dinner reservation. She threw the phone onto the counter, her hands trembling. This couldn't be happening. Her entire world was collapsing. First, she lost Frank. Now, Greg was gone too, and with him, the life she thought she had secured had disappeared. The days that followed blurred together. Jennifer tried to pick up the pieces of her life, but they had already crumbled. She packed her belongings and moved into a rundown motel, unsure of what to do next. The luxurious life she had imagined with Greg had morphed into a nightmare. Every time she tried calling Frank, there was no answer. Her messages went unread, ignored. It was as if he had vanished, leaving her to deal with the wreckage on her own. She thought about returning to work, but the idea of facing Greg made her stomach turn. What had once been a thrilling romance now felt like a source of humiliation. She could already imagine her colleagues whispering behind her back. She was sure of it. With her marriage in tatters, she doubted she could hold on to her job for much longer. Greg wouldn't even need to fire her, she could feel it slipping away. As the weeks passed, Jennifer's hope slowly drained away. The glamorous dinners and nights in fancy hotels were replaced by lonely evenings in the cramped motel, where the stench of cigarette smoke and cheap cleaning products clung to her clothes. Greg's promises of a future together had evaporated, leaving her with nothing but regret. She was forced to face the harsh reality of her choices, decisions that had cost her everything. While Jennifer's life was falling apart, Frank's was finally coming together. With the chaos of his old life behind him, he stood at a crossroads. The weeks after his departure had been uncertain, but they brought with them a newfound freedom he hadn't felt in years. The weight of a marriage where he had constantly tried to please a woman who no longer cared for him had finally been lifted. Frank knew it was time to take control of his future. The first step was cutting all ties to the past that had held him back. He found a modest apartment on the opposite side of town, far from the house that carried too many painful memories. It wasn't luxurious, but it was his. There were no reminders of Jennifer, no remnants of their life together to haunt him. This was his fresh start, a place where he could rebuild himself without the shadow of a failed marriage hanging over him. The first few days in his new apartment felt strange. The silence was almost eerie. But this silence was different, it didn't suffocate. It brought peace. It was the sound of a life no longer controlled by someone else's demands. He spent his time doing small tasks, organizing, cleaning, getting used to his new surroundings. For the first time in years, Frank didn't have to explain or justify his decisions to anyone. When the novelty of the move began to wear off, he shifted his focus back to his career. Greg had always kept him under his thumb, making Frank feel smaller than he really was. These toxic relationships had eroded his self-esteem over the years. But now, with both Greg and Jennifer behind him, Frank saw an opportunity to reshape his life. He wasn't just looking to recover from his personal hardships, he was determined to thrive in every part of his life. One afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand, he opened his laptop and began searching for new job opportunities. But this time, he wasn't just looking for a paycheck. Frank wanted more than just a job. He craved something that would push him to his limits and help him tap into his full potential. He carefully crafted his applications, highlighting his skills, experience, and unwavering drive to succeed. Within a week, the responses started rolling in. Several companies, familiar with his reputation, were eager to bring him on board. But one offer stood out above the rest, a position at a tech startup known for its innovation and forward-thinking culture. Something about it sparked an excitement in him he hadn't felt in years. He scheduled an interview, and within a few days, he found himself sitting across from the CEO, discussing his ideas, his goals, and how he could help the company grow. The interview went better than he had expected. They offered him the position on the spot, along with a promotion he hadn't even dared to dream of, more responsibility, a substantial salary increase, and a level of autonomy he had never experienced before. As Frank walked out of the office, a wave of exhilaration washed over him. He had finally broken free from the grip of Greg and the job that had held him back for so long. This was the start of a new chapter. With this position came financial stability. The days of worrying about joint accounts and financial struggles were behind him. Recently, Frank had treated himself to a new car, sleek, fuel-efficient, and a symbol of just how far he had come. For the first time, he didn't feel that familiar twinge of guilt over such a purchase. This was a well-earned reward. As the months passed, Frank became fully immersed in his work. His career trajectory picked up speed, moving faster than he had anticipated. Not only did his colleagues respect him, but those higher up in the company began to recognize his talent and determination. But this wasn't just about a new job or a bigger paycheck. It was about proving to himself that he could succeed entirely on his own. He was no longer the man Jennifer had dismissed or the one Greg had once belittled. He had become something far greater, and his growth extended beyond just his career. Frank started focusing on his well-being, both physically and emotionally. For the first time in years, he joined a gym. His days became structured, filled with purpose and discipline. Mornings began with early runs at dawn, the steady beat of his footsteps reminding him of his renewed commitment to himself. Evenings were spent strength training, and after each session, he felt stronger and more confident. It was no longer about getting back at Jennifer, it was about reconnecting with himself. Little by little, small yet meaningful victories started piling up. He would wake up in his new apartment feeling truly rested. Weekends were spent exploring local hiking trails, the crisp mountain air clearing his mind and washing away the last traces of doubt. He developed real friendships with his new co-workers, people who valued him for who he was, not for his past or his connections. Step by step, Frank was creating a life that was entirely his own. One evening, sitting on his balcony with a glass of wine in hand, he gazed out over the city skyline, and a realization dawned on him: he was happy. Genuinely happy. It wasn't the shallow kind of happiness that comes from material success or career achievements, though those mattered too. This was a deeper, more profound contentment, the kind that comes after surviving a dark chapter in your life and emerging stronger for it. Every now and then, thoughts of Jennifer still crossed his mind, but they no longer stung. The memories didn't haunt him like they once did. Now, she was just a distant figure, a part of his past that held no more power over him. He had learned, he had grown, and most importantly, he had moved on. Jennifer might have tried to break him, but all she really did was free him from a life that had been holding him back from becoming his best self. Sitting there with a smile on his face, Frank reflected on how far he had come. He now had everything he once feared to chase. Where Jennifer was, he didn't know, and for the first time, he realized he didn't care. Her choices had led her down a path that no longer touched his life. Their roads had split, and for Frank, that was the greatest gift he could have received. Frank came to a powerful understanding: his happiness was his responsibility. As this truth settled within him, it brought both peace and clarity. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold, he quietly raised his glass in a personal toast. His life, once shattered by the end of his marriage, had been rebuilt stronger than he ever thought possible. What he now had felt new, more meaningful, and he could sense it was only the beginning of something even greater. While Jennifer's world crumbled under the weight of her own decisions, Frank's was finally starting to flourish. He was now in control of his destiny, free to shape his future however he wanted. Time moved on, but Margaret's guilt only grew heavier with each passing day. The thrill of her affair with Greg had long since faded, leaving only the raw pain of realizing what she had lost. For a brief moment of excitement, she had sacrificed her marriage, her stability, and the life she once knew. Now, all she had left was to live with the consequences of her choices, alone in her regret. At first, Jennifer tried convincing herself that things would eventually get better. After Greg left, she clung to the hope of a fresh start. She went on dates, searching for that same spark, but nothing compared. The men she met lacked the reliability and kindness that Frank had always shown her so effortlessly. Most of them were selfish or unreliable. Despite her attempts to move forward, the emptiness inside her never disappeared. Many nights, Jennifer lay sleepless, staring blankly at the ceiling of her small apartment, wondering how her life had unraveled so completely. Her mind drifted back to her time with Frank, their home, the memories they had shared, the quiet moments of comfort she had taken for granted. All of it was gone, and there was no one to blame but herself. One chilly evening, while scrolling through old photos on her phone, Jennifer came across a picture from their 20th anniversary. They were standing on a beach, the sunset glowing behind them, both smiling like nothing else in the world mattered. Her finger hovered over the image, and a sharp pain tugged at her chest. She vividly remembered that day, the surprise trip Frank had planned, the joy she had felt then, and the depth of his love for her. Tears welled up in her eyes. Before she knew it, they were spilling down her cheeks. "What have I done?" she whispered, burying her face in her hands as the full weight of her regret washed over her. For a long time, Jennifer had convinced herself that it was Frank's fault, that he wasn't good enough for her. But the painful truth was that it was she who wasn't good enough for him. She had let herself be swayed by Greg's empty promises and the excitement of something new. And in doing so, she had destroyed the one thing that had truly mattered to her. With each passing day, thoughts of Frank occupied more and more space in her mind. She couldn't stop wondering where he was now, how his life had turned out, and whether he had found the happiness she had stolen from him. The thought of him moving on, living a life far better than the one she now felt trapped in, gnawed at her relentlessly. The weight of her mistakes bore down on her, and Jennifer began to wonder if, by some miracle, there was still the slightest chance for redemption. Could she even ask for his forgiveness? The idea seemed ridiculous at first. After all, it was she who had left him, mocking his desperate pleas for her to stay that night. Yet, the guilt weighed so heavily on her that she couldn't ignore the growing urge to try. To do something. Anything. One day, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. The pen hovered in her trembling hand, fingers unsure of how to begin. How could she express the depth of her regret? How could she even ask for forgiveness when she knew, deep down, that she didn't deserve it? Time crawled by as she wrestled with herself, but eventually, she forced her hand to move across the page. Frank. I don't know how to start this or if you'll even read it, but I have to at least try. I've spent years reflecting on everything that happened, and not a day has gone by without me regretting my choices. I know the pain I caused can't be undone, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. Jennifer paused, the familiar ache in her chest tightening before she pressed on. But I want you to know how deeply sorry I am. Leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life. I was selfish, blind to everything you did for me. Only later did I realize what I had truly lost. I thought I needed something more, something different. But now, I understand how wrong I was. You were more than enough, and I was too foolish to see it. She sighed heavily, the weight of her past pressing down on her as she continued writing. I'm not asking for a second chance. I know that time has passed. I just need you to know how much I regret everything. You deserved far more than I was able to give, and I'm sorry for not being the partner you needed. I hope you found happiness, Frank. Her hand shook as she signed the letter. With deep regret. Jennifer. Tears blurred her vision as she reread the letter over and over. Carefully, she folded the paper and slipped it into an envelope. She didn't know if Frank would ever open it, but she had to send it. It was the only thing she could do to try to make things right, even if it seemed insignificant. In the days that followed, anxiety consumed her. She checked the mailbox constantly, hoping for some kind of response. Deep down, she knew the odds were slim, but a small part of her clung to the hope that Frank might write back. Maybe he would see the sincerity of her regrets. Maybe he'd even allow her the chance to apologize in person. But as the days turned into weeks, the painful truth became clearer. There would be no reply. Her mailbox remained empty, day after day, with no sign of Frank. The silence grew deafening, echoing louder in her heart with each passing moment. His absence wasn't just physical anymore. He had stepped into a new life, a future where she no longer had a place. She had severed their connection, and now he lived in a world where she didn't exist. One rainy afternoon, as she sat by the window listening to the rhythm of raindrops tapping against the glass, her phone rang softly from the table. Startled, she glanced over. It was a message from an old acquaintance she hadn't spoken to in what felt like forever. The title of the message made her stomach flip. Frank. Her heart began to race. With trembling fingers, she hastily opened the message. The message was brief, just a few lines, but its impact hit Jennifer like a tidal wave. Frank had remarried. He had found someone who valued him in ways Jennifer never could. The letter mentioned that they had recently bought a house together and were eagerly awaiting the birth of their first child with his new, younger wife. The weight of this news crushed her, leaving her gasping for air. Her vision blurred as she struggled to process what she had just read. Frank hadn't just moved on, he had thrived. He had built something beautiful, something she could never give him, far removed from the wreckage she had left behind. For the first time, the full weight of her choices bore down on her. There would be no return, no chance for reconciliation. Frank had permanently closed the door on her, building a future in which she had no place. As the rain softly trickled down the window, Jennifer sat paralyzed, the silence around her growing heavier. This was the life she had chosen, a life full of regrets, and the only person she had to blame was herself. Jennifer had never imagined her life would fall apart like this, isolated, empty, burdened by the consequences of her own actions. Once, she had envisioned an exciting future with Greg, the man for whom she had risked everything. But that dream never came true. Over time, the fantasy of a better life with him crumbled, leaving her to confront the cold reality of loneliness. One dreary evening, she sat in her dimly lit apartment, staring at her reflection in the window. Outside, the city lights twinkled, but inside, her world was cloaked in darkness. The silence pressed down on her like a suffocating weight. It had been 2 years since she had last heard anything about Greg. He had left her behind with the same indifference that had marked the end of their affair, no explanations, no apologies. He simply vanished, leaving her to deal with the wreckage of the life she had destroyed. At that moment, her phone vibrated again. Jennifer glanced at the screen, hoping for some glimmer of connection, maybe a job offer or a message from a friend. But it was just another cold reminder of mounting debts, a bill notification that cut through the quiet of her empty world. Jennifer's financial situation had completely unraveled. A series of impulsive decisions, costly divorce proceedings, and the sudden loss of her support system had left her utterly alone. The friends who once encouraged her affair, planting seeds of doubt about Frank's worth, had disappeared the moment her world began to crumble. Now, she was a burden, someone to be avoided. She sighed deeply, running her hands through her hair, thinking back to the days when life seemed simpler, more manageable. Frank had always been the one to handle everything. He took care of the finances, managed the household, made sure their lives stayed in order. It wasn't until she had lost it all that Jennifer realized how much he had done for them. Now, she stumbled through a world that seemed indifferent to her, whether she succeeded or failed. Her thoughts returned to Frank, as they so often did these days. It had become a painful habit, tracking him, watching the life he now thrived in without her. A few months ago, she had come across his new social media accounts, even though he had blocked her on all other platforms. His life had flourished in her absence, a stark contrast to the one they had shared. In every photo, Frank's smile seemed wider than she remembered, especially when he stood beside his beautiful new wife, Barbara. Jennifer had learned Barbara's name by chance during a brief conversation with one of Frank's old acquaintances at the grocery store. Barbara appeared to be everything Jennifer was not, caring, affectionate, a woman who would never take Frank for granted. The most recent post showed them on vacation in Paris, a place Jennifer had always dreamed of visiting but never made a priority. That image etched itself into her mind, leaving behind a dull, aching pain. She slammed the laptop shut, trying to escape the flood of memories, but the weight of regret stayed with her. Even after all these years since the divorce, the remorse felt as raw as ever. Every choice she had made since leaving Frank seemed like another mistake, dragging her deeper into a pit she couldn't escape. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, but this time it wasn't another bill notification. It was an email from a recruiter, yet another rejection for her latest job application. Her once thriving career had collapsed after rumors of her affair had spread through their shared social circle. It didn't take long for those whispers to reach her workplace. Soon, doors that had once opened effortlessly for her were slammed shut. She became infamous, the woman who had left her husband for his boss. No company wanted the baggage that came with her, and her resume had become a patchwork of short-term jobs and abrupt dismissals. Now, she worked as a secretary at a small real estate agency, far removed from the prestigious positions she had once held, just trying to make ends meet. Her paycheck barely covered rent and utilities, and her savings had long since dried up. With no safety net and no promising opportunities, her future looked bleak. In her desperation, her mind returned to the one option she had avoided for so long, reaching out to Frank. Jennifer couldn't shake the thought that if she just found the right words, maybe, just maybe, he would finally see the change in her. Perhaps then he would understand. She believed there had to be a way to rebuild the connection she had shattered. Frank had always been kind and patient. Surely, that part of him couldn't have disappeared entirely. It must still be there, even if buried deep. With a sense of urgency, she opened her laptop, searching for a way to contact him. It didn't take long to find his new consulting firm. He had recently founded it, another clear sign of how well his life had turned out since their separation. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the mouse, before finally clicking on the contact details. His professional email address stared back at her from the screen. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, but the words didn't come easily. What could she possibly say that she hadn't already said? She had sent him a heartfelt letter once, pouring out her regrets, but he had never responded. What could make this time different? Despite her doubts, Jennifer began to type. Frank. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, and I completely understand that. But I need to tell you how deeply sorry I am for everything. I was selfish and destroyed something precious. Every day since, I've wished I could undo what happened, though I know I can't. I'm not asking anything of you. I just want you to know how truly sorry I am. I've seen all you've accomplished since I left, and while it hurts to know I'm no longer part of your life, I'm genuinely happy for your success. I hope that one day, you'll be able to forgive me. Jennifer. She stared at the screen, her heart racing. Hours seemed to pass as she wrestled with herself. What was she doing? This wasn't her, desperate, clinging to a past she had ruined with her own hands. But what else did she have left? Before she could change her mind, Jennifer hit send. The email disappeared, taking with it the last shreds of hope she had held on to. The days blurred together after that. She constantly refreshed her inbox, waiting for any sign that Frank had seen her message. But as the days turned into a week and then two, the silence became unbearable. There was no response. He had moved on, and he had every right to.